Degeneration, a chapter in Darwinism. Essay by Edwin Ray Lankester, published in 1880. It is clearly enough possible for a set of forces such as we sum up under the heading natural selection to so act on the structure of an organism as to produce one of three results, namely these: to keep it in status quo, to increase the complexity of its structure, or lastly, to diminish the complexity of its structure. We have as possibilities either balance, or elaboration, or degeneration. Owing, as it seems, to the predisposing influence of the systems of classification in ascending series proceeding steadily upwards from the lower or simplest forms to the higher or more complex forms, systems which were prevalent before the doctrine of transformism had taken firm root in the minds of naturalists, there has been up to the present day an endeavor to explain every existing form of life on the hypothesis that it has been maintained for long ages in a state of balance, or else on the hypothesis that it has been elaborated and is an advance, an improvement upon its ancestors. Only one naturalist, Dr. Dorn, of Naples, has put forward the hypothesis of degeneration as capable of wide application to the explanation of existing forms of life, and his arguments in favor of a general application of this hypothesis have not, I think, met with the consideration they merit. Degeneration may be defined as a gradual change of the structure in which the organism becomes adapted to less varied and less complex conditions of life, whilst elaboration is a gradual change of structure in which the organism becomes adapted to more and more varied and complex conditions of existence. In elaboration there is a new expression of form, corresponding to new perfection of work in the animal machine. In degeneration there is suppression of form, corresponding to the cessation of work. Elaboration of some one organ may be a necessary accompaniment of degeneration in all the others. In fact, this is very generally the case. And it is only when the total result of the elaboration of some organs and the degeneration of others is such as to leave the whole animal in a lower condition, that is fitted to less complex action and reaction in regard to its surroundings than was the ancestral form with which we are comparing it, either actually or in imagination, that we speak of that animal as an instance of degeneration. Any new set of conditions occurring to an animal which render its food and safety very easily attained seems to lead as a rule to degeneration, just as an active healthy man sometimes degenerates when he suddenly becomes possessed of a fortune, or as Rome degenerated when possessed of the riches of the ancient world. The habit of parasitism clearly acts upon animal organization in this way. Let the parasitic life once be secured, and away go legs, jaws, eyes, and ears. The active, highly gifted crab, insect, or annelid may become a mere sac, absorbing nourishment and laying eggs. All that has been thus far here said on the subject of degeneration is so much zoological specialism, and may appear but a narrow restriction of the hypothesis to those who are not zoologists. Though we may establish the hypothesis most satisfactorily by the study of animal organization and development, it is abundantly clear that degenerative evolution is by no means limited in its application to the field of zoology. The traditional history of mankind furnishes us with notable examples of degeneration. High states of civilization have decayed and given place to low and degenerate states. At one time it was a favorite doctrine that the savage races of mankind were degenerate descendants of the higher and civilized races. This general and sweeping application of the doctrine of degeneration has been proved to be erroneous by careful study of the habits, arts, and beliefs of savages. At the same time, there is no doubt that many savage races as we at present see them are actually degenerate, and are descended from ancestors possessed of a relatively elaborate civilization. As such, we may cite some of the Indians of Central America, the modern Egyptians, and even the heirs of the great Oriental monarchies of pre-Christian times, whilst the hypothesis of universal degeneration has a very large share in the explanation of the condition of the most barbarous races, such as the Fuegians, the Bushmen, and even the Australians. They exhibit evidence of being descended from ancestors more cultivated than themselves. With regard to ourselves, the white races of Europe, the possibility of degeneration seems to be worth some consideration. In accordance with the tacit assumption of universal progress, in unreasoning optimism, we are accustomed to regard ourselves as necessarily progressing, as necessarily having arrived at a higher and more elaborated condition than that which our ancestors reached, and as destined to progress still further. On the other hand, it is well to remember that we are subject to the general laws of evolution, and are as likely to degenerate as progress. As compared with the immediate forefathers of our civilization, the ancient Greeks, we do not appear to have improved so far as our bodily structure is concerned, nor assuredly so far as some of our mental capacities are concerned. Our powers of perceiving and expressing beauty of form have certainly not increased since the days of the Parthenon and Aphrodite of Melos. In matters of reason, in the development of the intellect, we may seriously inquire how the case stands. Does the reason of the average man of civilized Europe stand out clearly as an evidence of progress when compared with that of the men of bygone ages? Are all the inventions and figments of human superstition and folly, the self-inflicted torturing of mind, the reiterated substitution of wrong for right, and of falsehood for truth, which disfigure our modern civilization, are these evidences of progress? In such respects, we have at least reason to fear that we may be degenerate. Possibly we are all drifting, tending to the condition of intellectual barnacles or Ascidians. It is possible for us, just as the Ascidian throws away its tail and its eye and sinks into a quiescent state of inferiority, to reject the good gift of reason with which every child is born, and to degenerate into a contented life of material enjoyment accompanied by ignorance and superstition. The unprejudiced, all-questioning spirit of childhood may not inaptly be compared to the tadpole tail and eye of the young Ascidian. We have to fear lest the prejudices, preoccupations, and dogmatism of modern civilization should in any way lead to the atrophy and loss of the valuable mental qualities inherited by our young forms from primeval men. There is only one means of estimating our position, only one means of so shaping our conduct that we may with certainty avoid degeneration and keep an onward course. We are, as a race, more fortunate than our ruined cousins, the degenerate Ascidians. For us it is possible to ascertain what will conduce to our higher development, what will favor our degeneration. To us has been given the power to know the causes of things, and by the use of this power it is possible for us to control our destinies. It is for us, by ceaseless and ever hopeful labor, to try to gain a knowledge of man's place in nature. When we have gained this fully and minutely, we shall be able, by the light of the past, to guide ourselves in the future, in proportion as the whole of the past evolution of civilized man, of which we at present perceive the outlines, is assigned to its causes. We and our successors on the globe may expect to be able duly to estimate that which makes for, and that which makes against, the progress of the race. The full and earnest cultivation of science, the knowledge of causes, is that to which we have to look for the protection of our race, even of this English branch of it, from relapse and degeneration. Zoological Retrogression by H.G. Wells, an essay published in 1891. Perhaps no scientific theories are more widely discussed or more generally misunderstood among cultivated people than the views held by biologists regarding the past history and future prospects of their province, life. Using their technical phrases and misquoting their authorities in an invincibly optimistic spirit, the educated public has arrived in its own way at a rendering of their results which it finds extremely satisfactory. It has decided that in the past, the great scroll of nature has been steadily unfolding to reveal a constantly richer harmony of forms and successively higher grades of being, and it assumes that this evolution will continue with increasing velocity under the supervision of its extreme expression, man. This belief, as effective, progressive, and pleasing as transformation scenes at a pantomime, receives neither in the geological record nor in the studies of the phylogenetic embryologist any entirely satisfactory confirmation. On the contrary, there is almost always associated with the suggestion of advance in biological phenomena an opposite idea, which is its essential completement. The technicality expressing this would, if it obtained sufficient currency in the world of culture, do more to reconcile the naturalist and his traducers. The toneless glare of optimistic evolution would then be softened by a shadow, the monotonous reiteration of Excelsior by people who did not climb would cease. The too sweet harmony of the spheres would be enhanced by a discord. This evolutionary antithesis, degradation. Isolated cases of degeneration have long been known. The popular attention has been drawn to them in order to point well-meant moral lessons, the fallacious analogy of species to individual being employed. It is only recently, however, that the enormous importance of degeneration as a plastic process in nature has been suspected, and its entire parity with evolution recognized. It is no libel to say that 3/4 of the people who use the phrase organic evolution interpret it very much in this way. Life began with the amoeba, and then came jellyfish, shellfish, and all those miscellaneous invertebrate things, and then real fishes and amphibia, reptiles, birds, mammals, and man, the last and first of creation. It has been pointed out that this is very like regarding a man as the offspring of his first cousins, these of his second, these of his relations at the next remove, and so forth, making the remotest living human being his primary ancestor. Or to select another image, it is like evaluating the modest poor relation at the family gathering to the unexpected altitude of Fountainhead, a proceeding which would involve some cruel reflections on her age and character. The sounder view is, as scientific writers have frequently insisted, that living species have varied along divergent lines from intermediate forms, and, as it is the object of this paper to point out, not necessarily in an upward direction. In fact, the path of life, so frequently compared to some steadily rising mountain slope, is far more like a footway worn by leisurely wanderers in an undulating country. Excelsior biology is a popular and poetic creation. The real form of a phylum, or line of descent, is far more like the course of a busy man moving about a great city. Sometimes it is underground, sometimes it doubles and twists in tortuous streets. Now it rises far overhead along some viaduct, and again the river is taken advantage of in these varied journeyings to and fro. Upward and downward these threads of pedigree interweave, slowly working out a pattern of accomplished things with which the word evolution is popularly associated. The best known, and perhaps the most graphic and typical, illustration of the downward course is to be found in the division of the tunicata. These creatures constitute a group which is, in several recent schemes of classification, raised to the high rank of a subphylum, and which includes, among a great variety of forms, the fairly common sea squirts, or ascidians, of our coasts. By an untrained observer, a specimen of these would at first very probably be placed in the mineral or vegetable kingdoms. Externally, they are simply shapeless lumps of a stiff, semi-transparent, cartilaginous substance in which pebbles, twigs, and dirt are embedded. And only the most careful examination of this unpromising exterior would discover any evidence of the living thing within. A penknife, however, serves to lay bare the animal inside this house, or test, and the fleshy texture of the semi-transparent body must then convince the unscientific investigator of his error. He would forthwith almost certainly make a fresh mistake in his classification of this new animal. Like most zoologists, until a comparatively recent date, he would think of such impassive and, from the human point of view, lowly beings as the oyster and mussel as its brethren, and a superficial study of its anatomy might even strengthen this opinion. As a matter of fact, however, these singular creatures are far more closely related to the vertebra. They lay claim to the quarterings, not of mollusks, but of imperial man. And, like novelette heroes with a birthmark, they carry their proofs about them. This startling and very significant fact is exhibited in the details of their development. It is a matter of common knowledge that living things repeat in a more or less blurred and abbreviated series their generalized pedigree in their embryological changes. For instance, as we shall presently remind the reader, the developing chick or rabbit passes through a fish-like stage, and the human fetus wears an undeniable tail. In the cases of these ascidians, the fertilized egg cell, destined to become a fresh individual, takes almost from the first an entirely different course from that pursued by the mollusks. Instead, the dividing and growing ovum exhibits phases resembling in the most remarkable way those of the lowliest among fishes, the lancelet, or amphioxus. The method of division, the formation of the primitive stomach and body cavity, and the origin of the nervous system are identical, and a stage is attained in which the young organism displays, or else simulates in an altogether inexplicable way, vertebrate characteristics. It has a notochord, or primary skeletal axis, the representative or forerunner in all vertebrata of the backbone. It displays gill slits behind its mouth, as do all vertebrated animals in the earlier stages only or throughout life. And finally, the origin and position of its nervous axis are essentially and characteristically vertebrate. In these three independent series of structures, the young ascidian stands apart from all invertebrated animals and manifests its high descent. In fact, at this stage it differs far more widely from its own adult form than it does from amphioxus, or a simplified tadpole. Like a tadpole, the animal has a well-developed tail which propels its owner vigorously throughout the water. There is a conspicuous single eye, reminding the zoologist at once of the polyphemus eye that almost certainly existed in the central group of the vertebrata. There are also serviceable organs of taste and hearing, and the lively movements of the little creature justify the supposition that its being is fairly full of endurable sensations. But this flush of golden youth is sadly transient. It is barely attained before a remarkable and depressing change appears in the drift of development. The ascidian begins to take things seriously. A deliberate sobriety gradually succeeds its tremulous vivacity. La allegro dies away. The tones of il pensereso become dominant. On the head appear certain sucker-like creatures, structures, if you will, paralleled, one may note, in the embryos of certain ganoid fishes. The animal becomes dull, moves about more and more slowly, and finally fixes itself by these suckers to a rock. It has settled down in life. The tail that waggled so merrily undergoes a rapid process of absorption. Eye and ear, no longer needed, atrophy completely. And the skin secretes the coarse, inorganic-looking test. It is very remarkable that this test should consist of a kind of cellulose, a compound otherwise almost exclusively confined to the vegetable kingdom. The transient glimpse of vivid animal life is forgotten, and the rest of this existence is a passive receptivity to what chance and the water bring along. The Ascidian lives henceforth in idyll of contentment, glued, head downward, to a stone. The world forgetting, by the world forgot. Now here, to all who refer nature to one rigid state of precedence, is an altogether inexplicable thing. A creature on a level, at lowest, immediately next to vertebrated life, turns back from the upward path and becomes at last a merely vegetative excrescence on a rock. It is lower even than the patriarchal amoeba of popular science, if we take psychic life as the standard. For does not even the amoeba crawl after and choose its food and immediate environment? We have then, as I have read somewhere, I think it was in an ecclesiastical biography, a career not perhaps teemingly eventful, but full of the richest suggestion and edification. And here one may note a curious comparison which can be made between this life history and that of many a respectable pinnacle and gargoyle on the social fabric. Every respectable citizen of the professional classes passes through a period of activity and imagination, of liveliness and eccentricity, of sternund drang. He shocks his aunts. Presently, however, he realizes the sober aspect of things. He becomes dull. He enters a profession. Suckers appear on his head, and he studies. Finally, by virtue of these, he settles down. He marries. All his wild ambitions and subtle aesthetic perceptions atrophy as needless in the presence of calm domesticity. He secretes a house, or establishment, round himself, of inorganic and servile material. His bohemian tale is discarded. Henceforth his life is a passive receptivity of what chance and the drift of his profession bring along. He lives in almost entirely vegetative excrescence on the side of the street, and in the tranquility of his calling finds that colorless contentment that replaces happiness. But this comparison is possibly fallacious, and is certainly a digression. The Ascidian, though a pronounced case of degradation, is only one of an endless multitude. Those shelly warts that cover every fragment of seaside shingle are degraded crustaceans. At first they are active and sensitive creatures, similar essentially to the earlier phases of the life history of a prawn. Other cirripeds and many copepods sink down still deeper to almost entire shapelessness and loss of organization. The corals, sea mats, and the immobile oysters and mussels are undoubtedly descended from free-living ancestors with eye spots and other sense organs. Various sea worms and holothurians have also taken to covering themselves over from danger, and so have deliberately foregone their dangerous birthright to a more varied and active career. The most fruitful and efficient cause of degradation, however, is not simply akin to it, and aptness for parasitism. There are whole orders and classes thus pitifully submerged. The acarina, or mites. include an immense array of genera profoundly sunken in this way, and the great majority of both the flat and round worms are parasitic degeneration forms. The vile tapeworm, at the nadir, seems to have lost even common sensation. It has become an insensible mechanism of evil, a multiplying disease spot, living to that extent, and otherwise utterly dead. Such evident and indisputable present instances of degeneration alone would form a very large proportion of the catalogue of living animals. If we were to add to this list the names of all those genera, the ancestors of which have at any time sunk to rise again, it is probable that we should have to write down the entire roll of the animal kingdom. In some cases, the degradation has been a strategic retrogression. The type has stooped to conquer. This is, perhaps, most manifest in the case of the higher vertebrate types. It is one of the best known embryological facts that a bird or mammal starts in its development as if a fish were in the making. The extremely ugly embryo of such types has gill slits, sense organs, facial parts, and limbs resembling far more closely those of a dogfish than its own destined adult form. To use a cricketing expression, it is pulled subsequently into its later line of advance. The comparative anatomy of almost every set of organs in the human body enforces the suggestion of this ovarian history. We find what are certainly modified placoid fish scales, pressed into the work of a skull covering, while others retain their typical enamel caps as teeth. The skull itself is a piscine cranium, ossified and altered in the most patchy way to meet the heavier blows that bodies falling through air instead of water deliver. The nasal organ is a fish's nasal organ, constructed to smell in water, and the roof of the mouth and front of the skull have been profoundly altered to meet a fresh set of needs in aerial life. The eardrum, in a precisely similar way, is derived from a gill slit twisted up to supplement the aquatic internal ear, which would otherwise fail to appreciate the weaker sound waves in air. The bathymetric air bladder becomes twisted and patched to fit a life out of water. Nowhere organs built specially for this very special condition. There is nothing like this in the case of there the organs are from the first recognizable sketches of their adult forms, and they develop straightforwardly. But the higher types go a considerable distance towards the fish, and then turn round and complete their development in an entirely opposite direction. This turning is evidently precisely similar in nature, though not in effect, to the retrogression of the Ascidian after its pisiform or larval stage. If the reader can bear the painful spectacle of his ancestors' degradation, I would ask him to imagine the visit of some bodiless Linnaeus to this world during the Upper Silurian period. Such a spirit would, of course, immediately begin to classify animated nature neatly and swiftly. It would be at once apparent that the most varied and vigorous life was to be found in the ocean. On the land of a monotonous vegetation of cryptograms would shelter a sparse fauna of insects, gastropods, and arachnids. But the highest life would certainly be the placoid fishes of the seas, the ancient representatives of the sharks and rays. On the diverse grounds of power, size, and activity, these would head any classification he planned. If our Linnaeus were a disembodied human spirit, he would immediately appoint these placoids his ancestors, and consent to a further analysis of the matter only very reluctantly, and possibly even with severe remarks and protests,
about carrying science too far. The true forefathers of the reader, however, had even at that early period very probably already left the seas, and were, with a certain absence of dignity, accommodating themselves to the necessities of air breathing. It is almost certain that the seasonal differences of that time were very much greater than they are now. Intensely dry weather followed stormy, rainy seasons, and the rivers of that forgotten world, like some tropical rivers of today, were at one time tumultuous floods, and at another baking expanses of mud. In such rivers it would be idle to expect self-respecting, gill-breathing fish. Our imaginary zoological investigator would, however, have found that they were not altogether tenantless. Swimming in the pluvial waters, or inert and caked over by the torrid mud, he would have discovered that he would certainly have regarded as lowly, specially modified, and degenerate relations of the active denizens of the ocean, the dipnoi, or mudfish. He would have found in conjunction with the extremely primitive skull, axial skeleton, and fin possessed by these Silurian mudfish, a remarkable adaptation of the swimming bladder to the needs of the waterless season, inhabitants of the earth, nor have they awarded them a place in the category of nature. Why were they living thus in inhospitable rivers, and spending half their lives half-baked in river mud? The answer would be the old story of degeneration again. They had failed in the struggle. They were less active and powerful than their rivals of the sea, and they had taken the second great road of preservation, flight. Just as the Ascidian has retired from an open sea too crowded and full of danger to make life worth the trouble, so in that older epoch did the mudfish. They preferred dirt, discomfort, and survival to a gallant fight and death. Very properly, then, they would be classed in our zoologists' scheme as a degenerate group. Some conservative descendants of these mudfish live today, in African and Australian rivers, archaic forms that have kept right up to the present the structure of Paleozoic days. Others of their children, however, have risen in the world again. The gill-breathing stage becomes less and less important, and the air bladder was constantly elaborated under the slow, incessant molding of circumstances to the fashion of a more and more efficient breathing organ. Emigrants from the rivers swarmed over the yet uncrowded land. Aldermanic amphibia were the magnates of the great coal measure epoch, to give place presently to the central group of reptiles. From these sprang divergently the birds and mammals, and finally the last of the mudfish family, man, the heir of ages. He it is who goes down to the sea in ships, and with wide-sweeping nets and hooks cunningly baited, beguiles the children of those who drove his ancestors out of the water. Thus the whirligig of time brings round its revenges, still, in an age of excessive self-admiration. It would be well for man to remember that his family was driven from the waters by the fishes, who still, in spite of incidental fish-hooks, scenes, and dredges, hold that empire triumphantly against him. Witness especially the trout. I doubt whether it has ever been captured except by sheer misadventure. These brief instances of degradation may perhaps suffice to show that there is a good deal to be found in the work of biologists, quite inharmonious with such phrases as the progress of ages and the march of mind. The zoologist demonstrates that advance has been fitful and uncertain. Rapid progress has often been followed by rapid extinction or degeneration, while, on the other hand, a form lowly and degraded has, in its degradation, often happened upon some fortunate discovery or valuable discipline and risen again, like a more fortunate Anteos, to victory. There is, therefore, no guarantee in scientific knowledge of man's permanence or permanent ascendancy. He has a remarkably variable organization, and his own activities and increase cause the conditions of his existence to fluctuate far more widely than those of any animal have ever done. The presumption is that before him lies a long future of profound modification, but whether that will be, according to present ideals, upward or downward, no one can forecast. Still, so far as any scientist can tell us, it may be that instead of this. Nature is, in unsuspected obscurity, equipping some now humble creature with wider possibilities of appetite, endurance, or destruction, to rise in the fullness of time and sweep Homo away into the darkness from which his universe arose. The coming beast must certainly be reckoned in any anticipatory calculations regarding the coming man.
Part 3. Excerpt from Max Nordau's book Degeneration, originally published in 1895. Book 1. Fin-de-siècle, The Dusk of Nations. One epoch of history is unmistakably in its decline, and another is announcing its approach. There is a sound of rending in every tradition, and it is as though the morrow would not link itself with today. Things as they are totter and plunge, and they are suffered to reel and fall, because man is weary, and there is no faith that it is worth an effort to uphold them. Views that have hitherto governed minds are dead or driven hence like disenthroned kings, and for their inheritance they that hold the titles and they that would usurp are locked in struggle. Meanwhile, interregnum in all its terrors prevails. There is confusion among the powers that be. The millions, robbed of its leaders, knows not where to turn. The strong work their will, false prophets arise. The dominion is divided amongst those whose rod is the heavier, because their time is short. Men look with longing for whatever new things are at hand, without presage whence they will come or what they will be. They have hope that in the chaos of thought, art may yield revelations of the order that is to follow on this tangled web. The poet, the magician, is to announce, or divine, or at least suggest in what forms civilization will further be evolved. What shall be considered good tomorrow? What shall be beautiful? What shall we know tomorrow? Who believe in? What shall inspire us? How shall we enjoy? So rings the question from the thousand voices of the people, and where a market vendor sends up his booth and claims to give an answer, where a fool or a knave suddenly begins to prophesy in verse or prose, in sound or color, or professes to practice his art otherwise than his predecessors and competitors, there gathers a great concourse, crowding around him to seek in what he has wrought, as in oracles of the Pythia, some meaning to be divined and interpreted. And the more vague and insignificant they are, the more they seem to convey of the future to the poor gaping souls gasping for revelations, and the more greedily and passionately they expounded. Such is the spectacle presented by the doings of men in the reddened light of the dusk of nations. Massed in the sky, the clouds are aflame in the weirdly beautiful glow which was observed for the space of years after the eruption of Krakatoa. Over the earth the shadows creep with deepening gloom, wrapping all objects in a mysterious dimness, in which all certainty is destroyed, and any guess seems plausible. Forms lose their outlines and are dissolved in floating mist. The day is over, the night draws on. The old anxiously watch its approach, fearing they will not live to see the end. A few amongst the young and strong are conscious of the vigor of life in all their veins and nerves, and rejoice in the coming sunrise. Dreams, which fill up the hours of darkness till the breaking of the new day, bring to the former comfortless memories, to the latter high-souled hopes. And in the artistic products of the age, we see the form in which these dreams become sensible. Here is the place to forestall a possible misunderstanding. The great majority of the middle and lower classes is naturally not fin-de-siècle. It is true that the spirit of the times is stirring the nation down to the lowest depths, and awaking even in the most inchoate and rudimentary human being a wondrous feeling of stir, and in him the cravings of travailing women, nor express itself in new aesthetic needs. The Philistine or the proletarian still finds undiluted satisfaction in the old and oldest forms of art and poetry. If he knows himself unwatched by the scornful eye of the votary of fashion, and is free to yield to his own inclinations, he prefers Onet's novels to all the symbolists, and Mascagni's Cavalleria Rusticana to all Wagnerians and to Wagner himself. He enjoys himself royally over slapdash farces and music hall melodies, and yawns or is angered at Ibsen. He contemplates gladly chromos of paintings depicting Munich beerhouses and rustic taverns, and passes the open-air painters without a glance. It is only a very small minority who honestly find pleasure in the new tendencies, and announce them with genuine conviction as that which alone is sound, a sure guide for the future, a pledge of pleasure and of moral benefit. But this minority has the gift of covering the whole visible surface of society, as a little oil extends over a large area of the surface of the sea. It consists chiefly of rich, educated people, of fanatics. The former give the ton to all the snobs, the fools and the blockheads. The latter make an impression upon the weak and dependent, and intimidate the nervous. All snobs affect to have the same taste as the select and exclusive minority, who pass by everything that once was considered beautiful with an air of the greatest contempt. And thus it appears as if the whole of civilized humanity were converted to the aesthetics of the dusk of the nations. Diagnosis. The manifestations must be patent enough to everyone, be he never so narrow a Philistine. The Philistine, however, regards them as a passing fashion and nothing more. For him the current terms, caprice, eccentricity, affectation of novelty, imitation, instinct, afford a sufficient explanation. The purely literary mind, whose merely aesthetic culture does not enable him to understand the connection of things, and to seize their real meaning, deceives himself and others as to his ignorance by means of sounding phrases and loftily talks of a restless quest of a new ideal by the modern spirit. The richer vibrations of the refined nervous system of the present day, the unknown sensations of an elect mind. But the physician, especially if he has devoted himself to the special study of nervous and mental maladies, recognizes at a glance, in the fin-de-siècle disposition, in the tendencies of contemporary art and poetry, in the life and conduct of the men who write mystic, symbolic, and decadent works, and the attitude taken by their admirers in the tastes and aesthetic instincts of a fashionable society. The confluence of two well-defined conditions of disease with which he is quite familiar, viz., degeneration, degeneracy, differ from each other, yet have many features in common, and frequently occur together, so that it is easier to observe them in their composite forms than each in isolation. The conception of degeneracy, which at this time obtains throughout the science of mental disease, was first clearly grasped and formulated by Morel. In his principal work, often quoted, but unfortunately not sufficiently read, the following definition of what he wishes to be understood by degeneracy is given by this distinguished expert in mental pathology, who was, for a short time, famous in Germany. The notion we can form of degeneracy is to regard it as a morbid deviation from an original type. This deviation, even if at the outset it was ever so slight, contained transmissible elements of such a nature that anyone bearing in him the germs becomes more and more incapable of fulfilling his functions in the world, and mental progress, already checked in his own person, finds itself menaced also in his descendants. An organism becomes debilitated. Its successors will not resemble the healthy, normal type of the species, with capacities for development, but will form a new subspecies in a continuously increasing degree, its peculiarities, these being morbid deviations from the normal form, gaps in development, malformations, and infirmities. That which distinguishes degeneracy from the formation of new species, phylogeny, is that the morbid variation does not continuously subsist and propagate itself, like one that is healthy, but unfortunately is soon rendered sterile, and after a few generations often dies out before it reaches the lowest grade of organic degradation. Degeneracy betrays itself among men in certain physical characteristics, which are denominated stigmata, or brand marks, an unfortunate term derived from a false idea, as if degeneracy were necessarily the consequence of a fault, and the indication of it as a punishment. Such stigmata consists of deformities, multiple and stunted growths in the first line of asymmetry, the unequal development of the two halves of the face and cranium, then imperfection in the development of these, or protrudes from the head, like a handle, and the lobe of which is either lacking or adhering to the head, and the helix of which is not involuted. Further, squint eyes, hare lips, irregularities in the form and position of the teeth, pointed or flat palates, webbed or supernumerary fingers. Lombroso has conspicuously broadened our knowledge of stigmata, but he apportions them merely to his, quote, born criminals, a limitation which, from the very scientific standpoint of Lombroso himself, cannot be justified. His born criminals, no, being nothing but a subdivision of degenerates. Fair expresses this very emphatically when he says, quote, vice, crime, and madness are only distinguished from each other by social prejudices. There might be a sure means of proving that the application of the term degenerates to the originators of all of the fin-de-siècle movements in art and literature is not arbitrary, that it is no baseless conceit, but a fact, and that would be a careful physical examination of the persons concerned, and an inquiry into their pedigree. In almost all cases, relatives would be met with who were undoubtedly degenerate, and one or more stigmata discovered which would indisputably establish the diagnosis of degeneration. In the mental development of degenerates, we meet with the same irregularity that we have observed in their physical growth. The asymmetry of face and ladder are completely stunted, and the cranium, as it were, is a counterpart in their mental faculties. Some of the latter are completely stunted, others morbidly exaggerated. That which nearly all degenerates lack is the sense of morality and of right and wrong. For them there exists no law, no decency, no modesty. Another mental stigma of degenerates is their emotionalism. He laughs until he sheds tears, or weeps copiously without adequate occasion. A commonplace line of prose sends a shudder down his back. He falls into raptures before indifferent pictures or statues. And music, especially, even the most insipid and least commendable, arouses in him the most vehement emotions. He is quite proud of being so vibrant a musical instrument, and boasts that where the Philistine remains completely cold, he feels his inner self confounded, the depths of his being broken up, and the bliss of the beautiful possessing him to the tips of his fingers. Besides moral insanity and emotionalism, there is to be observed in the degenerate a condition of mental weakness and despondency, which, according to the circumstances of his life, assumes the form of pessimism, a vague fear of all men, and of the entire phenomenon of the universe, of self-abhorrence. In this picture of the sufferer from melancholia, downcast, somber, despairing of himself and the world, tortured by fear of the unknown, menaced by undefined but dreadful dangers, we recognize in every detail the man of the dusk of the nations, and the fin-de-siècle frame of mind, described in the first chapter. I have enumerated the most important characterizing features of the mental condition of the degenerate. The reader can now judge for himself whether or not the diagnosis degeneration is applicable to the originators of the new aesthetic tendencies. From Egmont Hake, Regeneration, a reply to Max Nordau, published 1895. Who is the critic? Politicians, sociologists, economists, biologists, theologians, and the aesthetes have had their say, and each in their turn exercised a periodical spell over the public mind. It is now the turn of the alienists. Dr. Max Nordau has, by his book entitled Degeneration, produced no small sensation throughout the world, not least in this country. Though his work may not have made the stir of a sensational novel read by the millions, there can be little doubt that it has imposed itself on every educated mind in the country. It is no exaggeration to say that, like a sharp trumpet blast, it has awakened the educated classes from the lethargy consequent upon the din of clashing opinions and contradictory systems. This volume has once more roused us to the fact that we, as individuals, as a nation, as a race, are traveling at comet speed towards a goal of which we have no inkling. It sternly suggests that we are on the wrong road, and that a fate of a most horrible description is rapidly befalling us, an affliction in most people's view worse than annihilation. Madness is shown to be insidiously invading our minds. For characteristics revealed in his work, the observant reader will, no doubt, conclude that Max Nordau belongs to the Jewish race. He is evidently a free-thinking Jew, a type which we meet with everywhere, and against which as few objections can be raised as against any other type of man. The free-thinking Jew is generally clever, well-instructed, moral, and cheerful. His good qualities, however, do not prevent him from having his peculiar characteristics, which naturally influence his perceptions and feelings. He has generally a cut-and-dried life philosophy based on science and common sense, as well as on Jewish authorities. We cannot believe, with Max Nordau, that such signs as we see of degeneration spring from moral and intellectual weakness. In the external circumstances, we find sufficient cause for far more demoralization than actually exists, and the Germans, taken as individuals, show themselves to possess plenty of those mental and moral qualities which are the only possible foundations of a healthy state. They bear witness to the fact that, despite unfavorable outward circumstances, the race is not decaying, and that the present corruption and demoralization may be decay only of one stage of human development, from which, in obedience to some strong impulse, a new regenerating era may arise. In every country there are numbers of people striving and hoping to bring about a better state of things, even at the cost and sacrifice of some of the leading features of our civilization. There is a mass of evidence, including those peculiar features of modern society, on which Max Nordau has dwelt so largely, showing that a deep unrest has taken hold of humanity. The feeling is not only that we are moving in a wrong position, but that we are moving in a wrong direction. The general fear is not that degeneration has set in, but that, moving on the road that we do, we cannot escape it. The most striking characteristic of our time is that in no nation do we find, on either side of the Atlantic, any distinct indication of the road which can lead us past the slough of despond. The moral state of the civilized world is like a nation preparing for revolt against a tyrant. Gloomy, discontented, and excited men are encouraging one another with secret signs and passwords, mustering and drilling in secret places to be ready for action, but without any trustworthy leaders, without any plans for the future, without even any tactics for the first struggle. In some countries the cry is for leaders, but the old faith that the situations will bring out the men seems to have been utterly falsified, for everywhere mediocrity, prejudice, and corruption hold the helm. The cry in England and other countries is not for leaders, but for more light. We want a higher philosophy, nobler arts, a loftier literature, soundier principles of legislation, a purer religion. No nation holds a higher responsibility than the English. Its vast possessions all over the globe, its financial and commercial supremacy, its ethical influence over all the English-speaking countries, marks it out as the standard-bearer of civilization. Nothing great can happen among us without re-echoing in the remotest corners of the earth, and any step onward taken by us will send a thrill throughout humanity. Degenerate Englishmen may still wish to meekly follow other nations, but our mission is to be the practical, energetic, daring pioneers heading the march of progress. By using its great power and influence, the British nation can render invaluable service to humanity in the present crisis. In England must therefore rest our hopes for the practical solution of the grave questions on which progress and retrogression depend. From England alone can proceed that electrifying impulse of which the bewildered nations stand in need, that they may marshal the forces and focus the goal of progress. In our political circles, in the ranks of literature, and throughout all the strata of society, there are already unmistakable signs that the period of skepticism, selfishness, and rant will end with the century, that scientific superstition and sickly collectivist chimeras are doomed, and that the nation is sternly entering upon the mission of leading humanity towards good laws and institutions based on liberty, and thus inaugurating a universal movement which by its glorious results shall demonstrate that the alarming symptoms of degeneration revealed by the psychologists are the first symptoms of regeneration. From William James, Review of Degeneration by Max Nordau, 1895. A pathological book on a pathological subject. If one were to apply Herr Nordau's method to the description of his own person, one could hardly help writing him down as a degenerate of the worst sort. He is a graphomaniac, a misanthrope, and a misoneoist, a coprolalic. Idiot, imbecile are his mildest terms of endearment. In erotomaniac of the prudish sort, haunted by horror of other people's sexuality, an obsede, pursued without respite by images of odious works of art, a megalomaniac of the arrogant and insulting type, and finally, a victim of insane delusions about a conspiracy of hysterics and degenerates menacing the moral world with destruction, unless the sound-minded speedily arm and organize in its defense. Add to this equipment the earnestness of the gloomily insane and their complete inability to see a joke, pages of heavily invective against Oscar Wilde's epigrams, and one gets a not altogether consoling diagnosis of Herr Nordau's case. On the other side, it must be admitted that he is really learned, not only in contemporary German, French, and English belles lettres, but in the literature of neurological medicine as well, and that many of his objects by whose odiousness his imagination is afflicted, Parisian pornographic novels, are loathsome indeed. When, however, hardly a contemporary name, however great, escapes his abuse, and the course over which he runs amok lies through Wagner, Tolstoy, Ruskin, Burne-Jones, Rossetti, Zola, Ibsen, and Nietzsche, as well as through Baudelaire and his descendants, it must be admitted that his volumes are little more than a pathological document on an enormous scale, and an exhibition in minute detail of an individual's temperamental restrictions in the way of enjoying art. Part 6. From George Bernard Shaw, The Sanity of Art, an exposure of the current nonsense about artists being degenerate. Originally published 1895. After this long preamble, you will have no difficulty in understanding the sort of book Nordau has written. Imagine a huge volume, stuffed with the most slashing of the criticisms which were hurled at the Impressionists, the tone poets, and the philosophers and dramatists of the Schopenhauerian revival, before these movements had reached the point at which it began to require some real courage to attack them. Imagine a rehash, not only of the newspaper criticisms from the long-forgotten jibes against Oscar Wilde's momentary attempt to bring knee breeches into fashion years ago, to the latest scurrilities about the new woman. Imagine the general staleness and occasional putrescence of this mess, disguised by a dressing of the terminology invented by Krafft Ebing, Lombroso, and all the latest specialists in madness and crime, to describe the artistic faculties and propensities as they operate in the insane. Imagine all this done by a man who is a vigorous and capable journalist, shrewd enough to see that there is a good opening for a big reactionary book, as a relief to the Wagner and Ibsen booms. Bold enough to let himself go without respect to persons or reputations. Lucky enough to be a stronger, clearer-headed man than 99 out of 100 of his critics. Besides having a keener interest in science, a born theorist, reasoner, and busybody, therefore able, without insight or even any remarkable intensive industry, he is, like most Germans, extensively industrious to an appalling degree, to produce a book which has made a very considerable impression on the artistic ignorance of Europe and America. For he says a thing as if he meant it. He holds superficial ideas obstinately, and sees them clearly, and his mind works so impetuously that it is a pleasure to watch it. For a while. All the same, he is the dupe of a theory which would hardly impose on one of those gamblers who have a system, or martingale, founded on a solid rock of algebra, by which they can infallibly break the bank at Monte Carlo. Psychiatry takes the place of algebra in Nordau's martingale. This theory of his is, at bottom, nothing but the familiar delusion of the used-up man that the world is going to the dogs. But Nordau is too clever to be driven back on ready-made mistakes. He makes them for himself in his own way. he appeals to the prodigious extension of the quantity of business a single man can transact through the modern machinery of social intercourse, the railway, the telegraph and telephone, the post, and so forth. He gives appalling statistics of the increase of the number of letters written per head of the population, of the newspapers which tells us things, mostly lies, of which we used to know nothing. In the last 50 years, he says, the population of Europe has not doubled, whereas the sum of its labors has increased tenfold, in part even 50-fold. Every civilized man furnishes, at the present time, from 5 to 25 times as much work as was demanded of him half a century ago. Then follows more statistics of the constant increase of crime, madness, and suicide, of increases in mortality from diseases of the nerves and heart, of increased consumption of stimulants, of new nervous diseases like railway spine and railway brain, with this general moral that we are all suffering from exhaustion, and that symptoms of degeneracy are visible in all directions, culminating at various points in such hysterical horrors as Wagner's music, Ibsen's dramas, Manet's pictures, Tolstoy's novels, Whitman's poetry, Dr. Jaeger's woolen clothing, vegetarianism, skepticism as to vivisection and vaccination, and, in short, everything that Dr. Nordau does not happen to approve of. He is so utterly mad on the subject of degeneration that he finds the symptoms of it in the loftiest geniuses as plainly as in the lowliest jailbirds, the exceptions being himself, Lombroso, Krafft-Ebing, Dr. Maudsley, Goethe, Shakespeare, and Beethoven. Perhaps he would have dwelt on a case so convenient in many ways for his theory as Coleridge, but that it would spoil the connection between degeneration and railway spine. If a man's senses are acute, he is degenerate, hyperasthesia having been observed in asylums. If they are dull, he is degenerate, anesthesia being the stigma of the craziness which made all the women confess to witchcraft. If he is particular as to what he wears, he is degenerate. Silk dressing gowns and knee breeches are grave symptoms, and woolen shirts conclusive. If he is negligent in these matters, clearly he is inattentive and therefore degenerate. If he drinks, he is neurotic. If he is a vegetarian and teetotaler, let him be locked up at once. If he lives an evil life, that fact condemns him without further words. If, on the other hand, his conduct is irreproachable, he is a wretched mattoid, incapable of the will and courage to realize his vicious propensities in action. If he writes verse, he is afflicted with echolalia. If he writes prose, he is a graphomaniac. If in his books he is tenacious of his ideas, he is obsessed. If not, he is amorphous and inattentive. Wagner, as we have seen, contrived to be both obsessed and inattentive, as might be expected from one who was, quote, himself alone charged with a greater abundance of degeneration than all the other degenerates put together, and so on and so forth. There is, however, one sort of mental weakness common among men who take to science, as to many people take to art, without the necessary brain power which Nordau, with amusing unconsciousness of himself, has omitted. I mean the weakness of the man who, when his theory works out into a flagrant contradiction of the facts, concludes, so much the worse for the facts, let them be altered, instead of, so much the worse for my theory. What in the name of common sense is the value of a theory which identifies Ibsen, Wagner, Tolstoy, Ruskin, and Victor Hugo with the refuse of our prisons and lunatic asylums? What is to be said of the state of the mind of an inveterate pamphleteer and journalist who, instead of accepting that identification as a reductio ad absurdum of the theory, desperately sets to work to prove it by pointing out that there are numerous resemblances, that they all have heads and bodies, appetites, aberrations, whims, weaknesses, asymmetrical features, erotic impulses, fallible judgments, and the like common properties, not merely of all human beings, but all vertebrate organisms. Take Nordau's own list. Vague and incoherent thought, the tyranny of the association of ideas, the presence of obsessions, erotic excitability, religious enthusiasm, feebleness of perception, will, memory, and judgment, as well as inattention and instability. Is there a single man capable of understanding these terms who will not plead guilty to some experience of all of them, especially when he is accused vaguely and unscientifically, without any statement of the subject, or the moment, or the circumstances to which the accusation refers, or any attempt to fix a standard of sanity? And now, my dear Tucker, I have told you as much about Nordau's book as it is worth. In a country where art was really known to the people, instead of being merely read about it, it would not be necessary to spend 3 lines on such a work. But in England, where nothing but superstitious awe and self-mistrust prevents most men from thinking about art as Nordau boldly speaks about it, where to have a sense of art is to be 1 in 1,000, the other 999 being either Philistine voluptuaries or Calvinistic anti-voluptuaries, it is useless to pretend that Nordau's errors will be self-evident. Already we have native writers, without half his cleverness or energy of expression, clumsily imitating his sham, scientific vivisection in their attacks on artists whose work they happen to dislike. That was all passages from Book 1 of the fin-de-siècle, Degeneration. If you enjoyed this reading, then please feel free to leave a like and a comment below on what you thought of the video, and be sure to subscribe. You can also leave suggestions for future videos which you would like to hear me narrate.